Welcome to Dying in Grace, the program dedicated to educating our community about all aspects of death and dying, the end-of-life arena, and living well in our community. My name is Arlene Stepputat, and each week I like to bring a community member who has special expertise to talk with us about some aspect of death and dying or end of life. This week, I'm really excited to bring my friend, the CEO of Hospice of Santa Barbara, David Selberg, to be with us. And tonight, we're going to talk about one of my passions, which is end-of-life education, and getting our community and getting everyone in our community to talk about the D word.
Yes.
The death and dying word, and just be able to start getting comfortable with that.
Exactly. Thank you for having me, Arlene.
Oh, well, thank you for being here. And to that end, Hospice of Santa Barbara, and for our viewers, there's another show that we did on Hospice of Santa Barbara you can find on YouTube, Dying in Grace YouTube. And but this show is the unique initiative that Hospice of Santa Barbara has taken as a leader for community education. So how did you start the initiative, which is now the End-of-Life
Wellness End-of-Life Network.
But it started a couple of years ago, and how did that happen?
It did. At Hospice of Santa Barbara, we're doing every year a big annual event, and we fill the Marjorie Luke Theater in the middle of Santa Barbara with there's 800 to 900 people that can sit in there, and we filled it 2 years ago, or a couple of years ago, with this amazing speaker. His name is Frank Ostaseski, and he's known internationally. He started the Zen Hospice program in San Francisco, which was a little simple 6-bed facility, but the footprint that organization had on the national conversation on death and dying is huge. It currently is huge. And so when we invited Frank to come and talk on a rainy, cold night, we filled the theater, much to our surprise, with a waiting list of several hundred as well. And from that event and the enormous community outpour of interest and support, we established the Wellness End-of-Life Network, which is about 25 to 30 organizations locally that do anything related to end of life. So organizations such as Teddy Bear Cancer Foundation, Friendship Center, Antioch, Pacifica, that provide classes on end of life and caregiving and that sort of thing. So we've got about 25 organizations that meet monthly from that initial Frank Ostaseski lecture at Marjorie Luke Theater.
And you know, I'm on that committee, and I know that as somebody that's been studying people that have been talking about death and dying for a long time, like Ram Dass and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and Stephen Levine, I mean, really the cutting edge pioneers from many, many years ago. B.J. Miller, who has an amazing TED Talk, people can Google him,
yes,
and has a Santa Barbara connection. And is a triple amputee.
That's right.
Also, after Frank left, he became the executive director of Zen Hospice, and he's a doctor himself. And he came and spoke at Arts and Lectures, I think,
That's
at UCSB. Right. So he, as a personality, came and spoke. But then was it Hospice of Santa Barbara that convened him to talk to the players in the community? Yes,
we, with some significant funders in the community, asked him to come and speak and do sort of a working group with community leaders on end of life. And you were a part of that, Arlene.
I was,
yeah.
and I think because he too had a huge turnout. Now the difference too, well, we'll get back to Frank in a second, but what he did is he said, well, okay, this is great, but what are you going to do with it?
That's right.
And
yeah,
you know, I'm glad you guys are all in the same room and you have all these wonderful ideas, so what?
Exactly.
And then you all sort of picked up the mantle.
We did, and we've kept the conversation going. We've done a second annual event, the Wellness End of Life Network has, with Roshi Joan Halifax, another international speaker on end of life, and we're going to be headed toward our third year of doing another big speaker. And this Wellness End of Life Network, all these organizations, with you and I also at the table, are really spearheading this work. It's really, really fabulous.
Well, and I think that one of the things that happened is when BJ kind of put that what's next, I think somehow, I don't quite remember, but there were some conversations of these players meeting at the table, and then Hospice of Santa Barbara took the initiative to bring Frank here, and then the players, we actually had something to collaborate around.
That's right.
And we all used our various networks, and in that process, we started to learn more about each other and we built our own collaborative friendships and networks. A lot of us knew each other, but a lot of us didn't, or you met new people. And the thing about Frank Ostaseski and that event that is so critical is while people paid to go to Arts and Lecture with BJ Miller, this event was offered for free in the community.
It was. And it was just after the Thomas disasters.
Oh, that's right. I forgot
remember
about that.
that?
Yes.
Yeah, a couple months after. And we were thinking, well, turnout might not be all that significant. It was enormous, and we had a huge waiting list. So yeah, it was a totally free event. And it's helped elevate the dialogue of death and dying and what it can teach us in our community, and it's just critical.
Well, and I think the thing about Frank's message, and I also studied with Frank at the Meta Institute, but his book is titled The 5 Invitations, and it's such practical information, and of course he comes from a Buddhist perspective, which is what the Zen Hospice is about, but just simple things like don't wait, just take action now, or welcome everything, push away nothing, which are ways to approach working with death and dying, but they're ways to approach life. And I think that people heard that and really saw, oh, this is a message. I mean, and I think we know from working so much with death and dying that it, at least for me, it reminds me of the preciousness of each moment. It makes life sweeter.
Truly.
Because I'm mindful that tomorrow's not guaranteed.
It's so true.
And I think people are starting to wake up to that a little bit.
Yeah, truly. I can remember you and I went through the AIDS years together, and I can remember when people are actively in the process of dying, every day looking out the window, seeing nature outside the window, the world becomes so much more vivid and clear and treasured. And that's such a lesson of death and dying, isn't it?
Yeah, to not take anybody or anything for granted.
Truly.
Even the small little, the breeze on your face.
That's right.
Just the little things.
Truly.
So Frank came, it was an enormous success, and you did a survey.
That's right.
Of the community, and asked people what some of their concerns were, and that also got a great response. People don't like to fill stuff out when they're at an event, but with it, you got a really great response to people, and it was pouring down rain that night.
That's right.
And we were like, oh, it's Santa Barbara, people won't come out in the rain, and they did.
Yeah, they did, and hundreds of people filled out a very simple survey that night, and some of their responses were a little bit surprising. Some were consistent with what you and I would have guessed, which is I don't want my dying process or those I love to be about pain. Pain management was an important step or important feedback with that. There were several areas. You remember some of those pieces of feedback?
Well, there was also some concern about communities, about grieving children. Who gets left behind? How do we talk about grief? What happens to the grievers?
That's right.
That is an issue.
Yeah.
But then the group continued to convene based on that success.
Yes.
And then we brought Joan.
That's right.
And she also had come to Arts and Lectures earlier, and that was great for us because people already knew who she was. And again, it was a sellout crowd.
Truly.
And I think that what has also happened, David, is that Hospice of Santa Barbara has looked at what are the needs in the community to be educated. And you've taken some other initiatives where you're going out and helping people have conversations. And you and I talked about how do we bring about change, and you have a good theory about speaking with people and conversations.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk about, because you mentioned how you felt in the AIDS crisis, you told me this before, that how did you change people's minds?
You change their hearts and minds, I think, around HIV/AIDS by making it personal, and by making it something that wasn't an ostracized, stigmatized disease on television, but something that was a little bit closer to home. And that's what we try to do with community education at Hospice of Santa Barbara. We work well with another fabulous organization called the Alliance of Living and Dying Well. And their mission is really to help the community fill out advanced care planning documents. So things like the My Care document, so that as you and I are contemplating our dying process, what do we want that to look like? If we were tragically, if we were in an accident, if we had a significant sudden illness, a heart attack, a stroke, how would we want to be cared for? What would be the limitations on that care? What would we like our funeral to look like, our memorial to look like? So it's called advanced care planning, and what we're learning through the network you and I are a part of is that it takes multiple conversations to warm up people to this discussion. People are a little reluctant to dive right into a conversation about their own death, or the death of somebody they love.
It's kind of that old Woody Allen line, it's not that I'm afraid of death, I just don't want to be there when it happens. you know, and so that conspiracy of collective denial and changing the culture from such a youth-oriented culture to understanding, and even as young people, you can die. That's the other mythology. We think it's only going to happen to people that are, of a certain age, and of course that's not true at all. So there's been so Hospice of Santa Barbara continues to out of this coalition gather not only the events you're doing, but you've started to reach out to the partners, and can you talk about how you've made that available to our community so people could on the website?
Yes. So the website, by the way, is www.hospiceofsantabarbara.org, and as you go to our website, just click on the calendar for events, and so many organizations that are part of this network post things about what they're doing around this topic, death and dying, within their organizations. It can be, again, Teddy Bear Cancer Foundation. It can be CALM. It can be Visiting Nurses Hospice Care, Friendship Center. And so it's an easy place to sit and to look at what other organizations are doing on this topic of death and dying, and to support the community on it.
And a lot of those services are also free, whether it's the bereavement support or caregiver support meetings. So sometimes it's a one-off. We're having a special lecture, we're having a special guest. Visiting Nurse had a forum that they do for the community, also free. So there's that opportunity, but some of them are also some of the ongoing educational opportunities for people to learn how to be a caregiver for Alzheimer's, for instance. How do I learn those things? And I think this idea of making one-stop shopping, go to one site, see what's offered in our community, and they're almost all very low cost, and a lot of them are no cost.
That's right.
And so I think we're looking to shift where our community is. I know one of the gaps that we've talked about as a group is reaching out to the Latino community as well. And I know you've done a lot to translate information and do outreach in Spanish, and have bilingual staff. And
Yes.
are there other things that you're doing that I'm not aware of to
You know,
reach out to the group?
Our bilingual bicultural staff is really working with other organizations such as Leon, the Promotores Network in Santa Barbara, and
Let
others.
me just tell the viewers that LEON stands for Latino Elders Outreach Network.
That's right.
So that is kind of a subset of who we are, but
That's
in that
right.
community. So they're making the bridge there.
And these community leadership groups like Leon have really been sharing how it's different in certain cultures, in the Latino culture, for example, in the Latino community, and how death and dying might work in a somewhat different way than it does in other communities. Whether it's the actual My Care Advanced Care Planning document, or whether it's having workshops and conversations. So it's been really, really beneficial as we've reached out to various communities.
Have you seen a change, do you think, in the Santa Barbara community in general about a comfort level? Do you think there's more happening around end of life now than there was 15 years ago?
I think there is, and I think it's not just because you and I are so involved in those services and programs in town, because I'll be on State Street and folks that know me through the work I do will come up and say, oh my gosh, I went to a workshop at Visiting Nurses Hospice Care, or I went to a workshop at... So I think the conversation is being elevated. And you know, so much throughout the world, there isn't this huge fear and stigma around death and dying like we in this country have. You and I have talked about this. And I think of my grandparents' generation, where those that were dying, and even after they died, where it was not uncommon for the person who had died to lay in state in the home, and to have friends come over and visit the family. And how we've managed death and dying really since the 1960s, would you say, is that we remove death from our families. You know, funeral homes have made it very antiseptic, and in the back, in the back room. And so what we're trying to do is elevate that conversation, so it's less fearful for people. You and I both lost our significant parents at young ages, and I can remember when my mom died, you know, bless my family, but we never really talked about it. You know, and I was 10 years old. I think you were near the same age. And, you know, and I wanted to talk about it. And I went to school, and people were very kind. My friends were, the teachers were, but no one knew how to talk about it. So what we're trying to do, and what hospice does, is we go into schools and have these conversations with teachers, faculty, kids if there's a sudden death of a student or a teacher. And that's all part of this community education work.
Yeah, I think, well, I have a theory about why there's more dialogue in general, and I think it's because of the boomers.
I agree.
That
completely.
We've changed everything each time. You know, when we were born, they had to build more schools because they had to make more schools for us because there were so many of us. And you know, we had sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and women's lib, and all these different things that we were involved in. And now we're 10,000 people turn 65 every day.
Yes.
And so we're the groundswell. And I know that I think we've all seen people die in hospitals. Hooked up.
That's right.
I don't want that.
Yeah, and most Americans, when you ask them, where would you like to die if you're going through an illness where it isn't a sudden accidental or tragic death, where would you like to die? And most Americans say, in my home, surrounded by those I love, free of pain and in comfort. But most of us that go through illnesses don't die in our homes that way. And wow.
Well, that's true. And it speaks to the education of what are my options even. You know, starting with an advanced healthcare directive, like, no, do not hook me up on everything.
That's right.
And I know that one of the educational events that happened in the community was a screening of on Netflix. It's called Extremists. And that is about what it was a live, a real people in an ICU, God bless them, that let the cameras come in while they were making these decisions about their loved ones, who should we pull the plug or not.
Yeah.
And the conflict that can arise and the pain that arises without pre-planning.
Yes.
And
because if we don't pre-plan and we end up in the critical care unit of a hospital, that's a system that if you haven't informed them, they will do everything to keep you alive.
And they have to.
And they have to. So you and I sit on this network, this Wellness End of Life network, and we have the honor to have a physician there, a hospital working physician. And she'll say, people will come in that are 90, 95 years old, and these extreme measures are carried out on their bodies instead of a more peaceful remainder of their life. And they're hooked up to all these devices. And we're in control of that now.
We
as
are.
People.
We are, and I also think just in the literature, some of the common books that are coming out, like When Breath Becomes Air, which was about a physician who had cancer and wrote about it and actually died in the writing, and
Yes.
his wife finished it, but that became a bestseller, and there are more books coming out about previously taboo subjects, and to me it's like death is the last taboo.
Yes.
It is the absolute last
Yeah.
place we don't want to go, and yet we all have an expiration date. We all have to go there, and everyone
do.
we love is going to go too. So
Yeah.
it's not that it's less painful, but denying it isn't going to support anything.
Yeah, and you see it also when you watch the evening news, as we all experience these disasters, whether they're environmental, floods and fires, or whether it's a massacre at a school somewhere, where the first responders are struggling with the carnage and the death that they're seeing, whether it's a natural disaster or some horrific violent event. And so that also elevates the dialogue of how do we care for those that are caring, first responders that are doing this enormous work, firefighters, law enforcement, emergency room departments. That elevates the dialogue of death and dying as well.
Well, and it speaks to caring for the caregivers, all of the caregivers, whether they're the first responder caregivers or the nursing the nurse doctor caregivers,
Yes.
or the people, the aides that work in the care facilities,
That's right.
or the family members that
That's
are the
right.
caregivers. And that's also a conversation that has been somewhat neglected.
Truly.
I think, and I know one of the things that the survey had shown was the grief that caregivers in facilities carry.
Yes.
Because they have an elderly group, they have a death on a fairly frequent level of people that they have loved over the years.
That's
and
right.
They just put another body in another person fills that room, and
Yeah.
there's not enough in
There's
in a
not
lot
an
of places.
honoring of that elderly person that they took care of.
Or the loss of what they experienced.
That's right.
That's
right.
So in your vision going forward, if we had more awareness, like if you had a fantasy of what you'd like to see in Santa Barbara, what would that look like?
I think it would be where people don't see themselves so isolated in the grief experience that we all go through together, that they feel supported, that they're not alone. And that, again, that can be in a family, that can be in the sheriff's department, that can be the emergency room staff, that can be caregivers in a retirement facility, that we feel supported and connected to each other to be able to express our feelings and to talk about those that we love, our own fears around it. Wow, wouldn't that be an amazing thing if we were able to elevate that dialogue?
Yeah, and I think we're taking steps.
And
I think there are little pockets of one of the things that's so amazing about Santa Barbara, and what has been said by somebody like Frank, I remember Frank saying this, here's a man who travels around the world and said, you know, Santa Barbara is a unique community because of its resources, of the wide range of people that are here. And if any community can elevate that conversation about end of life, I think it's us.
We can be a model. We can absolutely be a model in this community. I remember it was La Crosse, Wisconsin, many years ago, and they had some like 95 or 100% of the community filled out advanced care planning documents, or what we call in our community as My Care documents. And that's extraordinary that that number of people in a mid-sized city in the upper Midwest filled out those forms, kept them current, and made sure that their loved ones, their community hospital, everybody knew. And it took years for them to do that, over 10 years, but wow, they did it. And we have the capacity in our community, Santa Barbara, to do that kind of effort as well.
Well, the other thing that I think is really important is starting with young people, like kids in school, and making it an okay topic, not like what we went through.
Yes.
And I read not so long ago about a unique dinner that millennials, or no, not even millennials, 20-somethings or 20 and 30-year-olds are having these, they call them death dinners, and it's a dinner for people who have had a loss of a parent or a sibling, and they talk about the death, like that's your potluck, and you had a death, and that's your ticket at the table. And they do 10 or 12 people at a table, and it's like this safe space to talk about their experience, and they don't want to go to a grief group. They talk to one another
over food. That's
over
wonderful.
Food, and that's extraordinary. So I'm hopeful that we are helping to shape and change the conversation.
Yeah.
I think that's what this show is really designed to do. That's my contribution to opening the dialogue and talking about the resources. So on that note, I want to thank you again, David, for being here, and I want to invite you to put a name of someone that you'd like to remember in our Book of Living Love. And I would like to thank TVSB for allowing us to film our show here. And I'd like to give my gratitude to my wonderful crew, Michael Nicholson and Elliot Jacobson. For those of you who are interested in other shows, please go to YouTube Dying in Grace or my website, dyingingrace.com.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.